The morning sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, painting soft blues and reds across the white lace of Megan's wedding gown. A small church stood by the edge of the lake, its bell ringing gently above the hum of guests settling into wooden pews. The air smelled of lilies, perfume, and nervous joy. At the altar, Daniel Ross adjusted his tie, trying to quiet the tremor in his fingers. To everyone watching, he was the perfect groom, clean-cut, confident, every inch the image of small-town respectability. His smile came easy, but his eyes betrayed him. There was something beneath that practiced calm, a flicker of unease that didn't belong on a day meant for love. Megan's father whispered something to her as the music began, a piano version of "Can't Help Falling in Love." The crowd turned as she stepped into the aisle. Her veil shimmered in the light, her face glowing with the kind of peace that comes from certainty. She looked at Daniel, and for a moment he almost believed it too, that everything was fine, that he could leave his secrets behind once the vows were said. He kept his gaze steady, nodding slightly, though his chest felt tight. The room blurred in front of him, colors blending into one long, dizzy moment. Behind his polite expression, a quiet storm brewed, memories he had buried clawed to the surface. A hand holding his in the dark. Laughter by the motel window. The echo of a voice whispering his name, Riley. The pastor's voice floated through the church, calm and rhythmic. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Daniel blinked hard. The edges of the room sharpened again. He exhaled slowly, gripping his hands together behind his back. Megan reached the altar, her smile wide and bright. He took her hand. It felt soft, trusting, and unbearably heavy. Rows of guests watched, whispering quietly as the ceremony continued. The hum of air conditioning mixed with the rustle of programs. Outside, wind stirred through the trees. Inside, time seemed suspended, fragile, balanced on the edge of something no one could see. When the pastor asked if anyone had reason these two should not be joined in marriage, a faint laugh rolled through the crowd. No one ever spoke in real life, not at real weddings. The moment passed. Daniel's lips parted in relief. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. And then, the back doors creaked open. The sound was small but sharp, cutting through the silence like a tear in fabric. Heads turned. The pianist hesitated, hands hovering above the keys. Sunlight flooded the entryway, framing a lone figure standing still. Daniel's heart stopped. A woman stood in the doorway, tall, poised, yet trembling slightly. Her eyes glistened, her hands clutching a small purse. Her presence carried something electric, an ache that seemed to pull the air out of the room. Daniel knew that silhouette even before his mind allowed it. Riley. Every muscle in his body locked. The air thickened. The whisper of confusion swept through the guests. Megan turned to look, her brow creasing. Riley's voice trembled as she spoke, barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to pierce the stillness. "Daniel." The sound of her saying his name shattered whatever illusion of peace remained. The room went silent, truly silent. Even the pastor froze mid-breath. Daniel's throat tightened. His pulse pounded in his ears. The ghosts he'd buried had walked straight into his wedding, and everyone was watching. The pianist's hand slipped from the keys, striking a discordant note that echoed like a warning. Somewhere in the back, a child began to cry. Daniel stepped forward, lips parting, but no words came. Megan turned back toward him, confusion giving way to fear. Riley took a single step inside the church, her expression a mix of sorrow and determination. And in that moment, before a single truth was spoken, before the chaos that would stain the next few hours, the world seemed to stop moving. Every breath, every sound, every life in that chapel hung suspended in fragile disbelief. The wedding had frozen in time. The sound of Riley's voice still echoed faintly in Daniel's mind as the story cuts backward, years before the wedding, before the church, before the lie became his life. It was late autumn. The kind of day when the sky looked like metal and the wind carried wood smoke. Daniel Ross had been assigned to a construction project in Cedar Falls, a small town a few hours away from his home. He was 34, already tired of his own reflection. The image of a man doing everything right while feeling everything wrong. That's where he met Riley. She worked at a cafe near the construction site, quiet at first glance, but her eyes were alive, curious, and bright. Her laughter came easy, disarming even Daniel's hardened reserve. She'd bring him coffee when the nights ran long, teasing him about his awful taste in music. One evening, rain lashed against the cafe windows. Daniel stayed after closing time, helping her stack chairs and mop the floor. They talked about small things, childhood towns, bad movies, places they wanted to disappear to. Then a pause. Riley hesitated, then said softly, "There's something I should tell you before this becomes anything." Her voice trembled. She told him she was transgender. She expected him to leave, to look at her differently. But he didn't. He just stared for a long time, then said, "You think that changes how I feel when I see you?" It was the first honest thing he'd said in months. From that night on, they lived in stolen hours. Cheap motel rooms, quiet walks by the river, late-night calls when the world slept. Daniel told her things he'd never said aloud, about his fear of failing, of never being enough, of being trapped in the version of himself others needed him to be. Riley listened without judgment, seeing him not as the man he performed, but the boy he still was beneath. He fell in love, though he'd never say it out loud. Not to her. Not even to himself. When the project ended, he told her he'd visit. For a while. Weekend drives, hidden from friends and family, pretending business trips. The guilt was part of the thrill, and the thrill was part of the love. But love built on fear can't last. One night, she asked him to meet her in the parking lot behind the cafe. The neon sign flickered above them, humming faintly in the dark. "Daniel," she said, "I don't want to be your secret." He looked away. "You know it's not that simple." "It is," she whispered. "You're just afraid." He didn't deny it. Weeks turned to months. Riley stopped calling. Daniel went back to his town, his job, his image. His mother introduced him to Megan, a kind woman from church. She was gentle, dependable, safe. She represented everything Daniel's life was supposed to be: clean, orderly, accepted. Riley reached out again after hearing he was engaged. "Tell me it's not true," she wrote. He never replied. For weeks, her messages went unanswered. He told himself ignoring her was mercy, not cruelty, that she'd move on if he vanished quietly. But guilt doesn't vanish, it just changes its shape. It crawled under his skin, showing up in his dreams, in every reflection, in every pause before saying, "I love you," to Megan. And then, days before the wedding, he received a letter. No threats, no anger. Just one line written in trembling handwriting. "If you can promise forever to her, at least give me the truth first." He crumpled the paper, shoved it deep into a drawer, and tried not to think about it again. But the past doesn't stay buried forever. Because somewhere, Riley had made a decision too. One that would bring her back through those church doors, into the light, into the moment where everything Daniel built would finally collapse. Riley's letter lay crumpled at the bottom of Daniel's drawer, but its words wouldn't leave him. They echoed in his head every time he rehearsed his vows, every time Megan smiled and said she couldn't wait to start their forever. He told himself Riley would move on, that silence was protection, not punishment. But deep down, he knew silence was just another kind of cruelty. It had been almost 2 years since their affair ended. 2 years since the motel room with the flickering light and the night he made a promise that changed everything. It was late, rain drumming against the windows, the air thick with unspoken truths. Riley sat on the edge of the bed, tears streaking her makeup. "You keep saying you love me," she said softly. "Then prove it. Leave her. Leave all of it." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "You don't understand, Riley. My family, my job, everything I've worked for." She cut him off. "I'm not asking you to ruin your life. I'm asking you to stop ruining mine." Her words hung heavy in the silence. Daniel sat beside her, taking her trembling hands in his. "I just need time. Let me figure it out. I swear to you, once I get my life in order, I'll tell her. I'll tell everyone. You'll never have to hide again." Riley stared at him, searching for honesty in his eyes. "You promise?" He nodded. "I promise." She believed him, Because love makes believers out of the broken. For weeks, that promise kept her alive. She waited, texting him late at night just to see the typing bubble appear. She sent him photos of the sunrise, of the cat they once rescued together. He replied less and less, each message colder than the last. Then one day he vanished. No replies. No goodbye. Just silence. Riley went through every stage of heartbreak, denial, anger, grief, numbness, until numbness turned into obsession. She followed his life from afar, through friends of friends, through the filtered perfection of his online world. When she saw the engagement post, his arm around Megan, captioned, "Forever starts here," something in her broke quietly, like glass underfoot. She wrote him again, one last time. "You promised me the truth. You don't get to erase me." No reply. 4 months, she fought with herself, wanting to hate him, but still replaying the nights he held her like she was the only real thing he'd ever known. Her therapist told her closure didn't require confrontation. Her best friend told her to let it go. But closure meant truth, and truth was the one thing Daniel had stolen from her. The night before the wedding, Riley stood in front of her mirror, fixing her makeup with shaking hands. Her eyes looked tired but determined. On the table beside her was the invitation she'd found online. The church, the date, the time. She had memorized it without meaning to. She wasn't going there to destroy him, she told herself. She was going there to remind him that promises don't disappear just because the world pretends not to hear them. Outside, the rain fell again, just like that night 2 years ago. It felt like a circle closing. She looked at her reflection, the same eyes he once said were too honest to hide. Then she whispered to the woman in the mirror, "He's going to see me. He's going to remember." Riley slipped the letter into her purse, the one he'd never answered, and walked out into the storm. And somewhere miles away, Daniel lay awake beside his fiancée, staring at the ceiling, feeling a pressure in his chest he couldn't explain, as if a promise he'd buried was clawing its way back to life. Morning sunlight crept through the blinds, warm and golden, too gentle for a day that would end in blood. Daniel Ross woke before dawn, his heart already racing. The house was quiet except for the soft rustle of Megan moving in the next room, humming under her breath. It was her wedding day, and she hummed because happiness came naturally to her. For Daniel, it felt like breathing through water. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the suit hanging neatly from the closet door. Black, pressed, perfect, just like the life he was supposed to be living. He ran a hand through his hair and forced himself to breathe. Today is the start of a new life, he told himself. Today, everything will finally make sense. Downstairs, Megan's mother was already arranging flowers, her voice floating through the hall. "Daniel, you look so handsome. You're one lucky man." He smiled politely, thanked her, and went outside for air. The backyard overlooked the quiet lake that bordered his hometown. The water shimmered, innocent and still. Daniel remembered the night he first told Riley about this place, how he used to come here to think, how it always made him feel clean. He hadn't been back since her. The memory made him nauseous. Inside, the clock ticked toward 9. The photographer arrived, followed by groomsmen, laughter, chaos. Daniel went through the motions, tying his tie, fixing his cufflinks, posing for photos. Every smile felt like a lie carved into his face. He caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. The man staring back was everything society asked him to be: stable, respectable, safe. But underneath, he could still hear Riley's voice whispering, "You're just afraid." He blinked hard, pushing the memory away. Not today. Megan entered quietly, her white robe brushing against the floor. She smiled, radiant and calm. "You okay?" she asked. "You seem far away." Daniel reached for her hand. "Just nerves," he said. She kissed his cheek. "It's normal. You've got a big heart. It's just catching up to the moment." He nodded, but her kindness only made the guilt burn deeper. He wanted to tell her everything, to rip the truth open before it poisoned them both. But what would he even say? That he'd lied for years? That the man she loved had once promised forever to someone else, someone he'd betrayed and erased? That truth would destroy everything. By noon, The house was alive with noise, laughter, champagne glasses clinking, music playing faintly from a phone. Daniel checked his reflection one last time before they left. His smile had finally settled into something convincing. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You thought I wouldn't come?" The words hit like ice water. His breath caught. He stared at the screen, pulse hammering. For a second, the room blurred. He opened the message again, praying it was a prank, but the ache in his gut told him it wasn't. Riley. He deleted the message instantly, hands shaking. His groomsman knocked on the door, calling out, "Let's go, man. The car's here." Daniel pocketed his phone and forced himself to move. Each step felt heavier than the last. The drive to the church was short but endless. Megan chatted happily beside him in the car, showing him her bouquet, talking about their honeymoon plans. He nodded in the right places, smiled when he had to, but his thoughts were a storm. What if Riley really showed up? What if she told everyone? He tried to imagine her face, to remember the softness in her eyes. But all he could picture was hurt, years of it, sharpened into something dangerous. When they reached the church, guests were already gathered, sunlight spilling through the open doors. The air buzzed with celebration, with innocence. Daniel stepped out of the car, straightened his jacket, and looked up at the cross on the steeple. For a brief second, he prayed, not for forgiveness, but for control. Then he smiled for the cameras, the crowd, and the woman who believed she knew him. The perfect groom walked into his perfect wedding. And somewhere down the road, a blue dress waited in the passenger seat of a car, Riley's hands trembling on the steering wheel, her heart ready for the truth she'd come to claim. The church bells rang at exactly 2 o'clock, their sound rolling across the lake like a calm before a storm. Inside, rows of guests filled the pews, faces glowing with anticipation. White ribbons hung from every bench, candles flickered gently, and the faint smell of roses floated in the air. Megan stood near the entrance, her veil being adjusted by her mother. She laughed softly, oblivious to the tension gathering like thunderclouds in the man waiting at the altar. Daniel Ross felt the air thinning with every second. His collar was too tight, his throat too dry. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the cool air inside the church. He clasped his hands together, whispering silent rehearsals of his vows, but the words refused to settle. He'd convinced himself the text was nothing, a cruel coincidence, a bad joke. Riley wouldn't really come. She wasn't like that. She'd never ruin something out of spite. At least, that's what he wanted to believe. The pianist began to play softly. Guests straightened in their seats. The pastor smiled. Daniel turned to face the doors, preparing to see Megan walking toward him. His clean slate, his perfect new beginning. But the door stayed closed. A murmur rippled through the guests. The music faltered for a second, then continued. Daniel frowned, glancing toward the back. The usher hurried to open the doors, expecting the bride. Instead, sunlight poured in. And there she was. Riley. She stood framed in the doorway like a ghost dragged out of the past, trembling but unbroken. A pale blue dress clung to her, rain-speckled and wrinkled from the drive. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup faint but smudged around her eyes. She looked exhausted, fragile, but there was a steel edge beneath her expression, a kind of quiet defiance. The room fell into stunned silence. Megan froze halfway down the aisle, her hand still clutching her bouquet. The pianist stopped playing entirely. The air became unbearably still. Daniel's blood ran cold. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to wake up, to find a way out, but he couldn't move. Riley's lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper, yet every syllable cut through the quiet. Daniel. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. His name hung in the air like a confession. Megan turned slowly toward him, confusion flickering into alarm. "Who is that?" she whispered. Daniel's mind fractured. Part of him wanted to rush to Riley, to plead with her to leave, to explain that it wasn't what it looked like. Another part wanted to disappear entirely. He stepped forward slightly, his voice low. "Riley, please." But Riley didn't move. She just stood there, tears forming but refusing to fall. "You promised me," she said, her tone trembling between heartbreak and fury. You promised you'd tell her. You promised you'd tell everyone. Megan blinked, her lips parting as the words sank in. The crowd began whispering. Someone coughed awkwardly. The pastor looked uncertain whether to intervene. Riley, Daniel said sharply now, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. You can't be here. Her eyes hardened. I gave you time, Daniel. Years of it. You said you just needed to get your life in order. She took a shaky step forward. And here it is, your life. Your wife. Your lies. Megan gasped softly, her bouquet trembling in her hand. Daniel, what is she talking about? He turned toward her, trying to speak, but words stuck in his throat. The crowd was no longer quiet. Whispers spread like fire, cameras lifted, murmurs filled the sacred space that moments ago held peace. Please, Daniel hissed under his breath, stepping closer to Riley. Not here. You don't know what you're doing. Riley looked straight into his eyes, unflinching. Yes, I do. I'm not here to ruin your wedding, Daniel. I'm here to stop pretending it never happened. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded photo, one he'd forgotten existed, the two of them at the lake, arms around each other, smiling. She held it up just long enough for Megan to see. Megan's breath caught. Her knees wobbled. You lied to me? Daniel reached for her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. Every sound in the room blurred into static, the whispers, the creak of pews, the pastor calling for calm. Daniel's jaw clenched. He turned toward Riley again, eyes wild now. Put it away. Please just... Riley's voice broke, trembling through tears. You said you loved me. And with that, the illusion shattered. Megan covered her mouth in disbelief, and Daniel's world collapsed in front of everyone he tried to impress. The man who built his life on control now stood stripped of it. The photo slipped from Riley's trembling hand, fluttering to the church floor. Daniel's expression changed, panic turning into something darker, dangerous. And as Riley took one more step forward, the tension snapped like a pulled wire. The church had gone silent again. The kind of silence that comes after an earthquake, heavy and disbelieving. The photo still lay on the floor, its edges curled slightly from Riley's trembling hands. Daniel stared at it like it was evidence of a crime he hadn't meant to commit but somehow had. His breath came in short bursts. His heart pounded in his throat. The walls of the church seemed to close in. Riley stood only a few steps away now, tears cutting faint trails through her makeup. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. You don't have to keep lying. Just tell her the truth. Megan turned toward Daniel, her eyes wide and wet. The truth about what? She whispered. He tried to answer, but his mouth was dry, his mind spinning. Every version of the story he could tell felt like another trap. He saw faces watching from every pew, co-workers, his mother, Megan's family, their pastor, all staring, waiting for the perfect groom to explain why another woman had come to his wedding calling his name. He took a small step toward Riley. Please, he said under his breath. We can talk outside. Riley shook her head. No more hiding. Her voice cracked. You said you'd tell them. You said once your life was ready, I'd be part of it. Daniel's jaw tightened. You don't understand what this will do, he hissed. I understand that I loved you, she said, trembling. And you loved me. You just didn't have the courage to say it where people could hear. A ripple of murmurs moved through the guests again. The pastor stepped forward, cautious. Perhaps we should all take a moment. Stay out of it, Daniel snapped, the words sharp, unfiltered. Megan flinched at his tone. The crowd gasped softly. Riley looked at him like she didn't recognize him anymore. You think yelling at me will make me disappear again? He ran his hands through his hair, pacing. His mind was a blur of humiliation and fear. His image, his career, his marriage, everything he'd built to protect himself from shame, was unraveling in front of strangers. He turned to Megan, desperate. She's confused, okay? She's just... Don't, Riley interrupted, voice cracking. Don't call me confused. Megan's voice was shaking now. Daniel, who is she to you? He froze. The question hung in the air like a blade. Riley stepped forward. Tell her. He said nothing. Tell her, she screamed, her voice echoing through the church like thunder. The sound snapped something inside him. All the fear, the guilt, the shame, it rose like a tide. His breathing grew ragged. He looked around and saw only judgment, eyes filled with pity, disgust, curiosity. His hand moved to his jacket pocket, instinct, not thought. Riley saw it first. Her expression changed, fear replacing defiance. "Daniel? Don't," he muttered. "Don't make me." "Daniel, no," Megan gasped, realizing what he was reaching for. Guests began to stand, whispers turning to shouts. Someone yelled for him to stop. Daniel's hands were shaking as he pulled the small black pistol from inside his suit, the one his father had given him, for protection. He hadn't planned to use it. Not really. Not like this. "Put it down," the pastor shouted. But Daniel wasn't hearing anyone anymore. The pounding in his head drowned out every sound. His world narrowed to Riley, standing there, trembling, eyes glistening with heartbreak and horror. She lifted her hands slowly, tears spilling now. "Daniel, please, you don't have to do this." He stepped closer, his voice breaking. "You ruined everything." Riley shook her head. "No, Daniel. You did." For a brief moment, something in him faltered, guilt, memory, love. It flickered across his face like a dying light. And then the trigger clicked. The crowd gasped, the sound of footsteps scraping against the wooden floor, someone screaming Megan's name. And in that suspended second, before the world shattered into sound and blood and chaos, time stopped again. The gunshot tore through the silence like thunder cracking the sky. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. The echo bounced off the church walls, ringing against the stained glass and holy silence, turning the sacred space into something cold and unrecognizable. Then came the screams. Riley stumbled backward, her body jerking from the impact, eyes wide in disbelief. A dark bloom spread across her white blouse, right over her heart. She gasped, a shallow, broken sound, trying to breathe, but the air refused her. Megan's shriek pierced through everything. "Daniel!" The gun clattered to the floor, its metallic clang snapping Daniel out of whatever trance he'd been in. He took one step forward, then another, his hand shaking, his lips trembling. I didn't mean." Blood pooled beneath Riley as she fell to her knees, eyes never leaving his. There was no hatred in them now, only heartbreak and something that looked almost like pity. "You promised," she whispered, voice barely a breath. And then her body went still. The world around them broke apart. Guests rushed to the doors, some screaming, others calling 911. The pastor was on his knees beside Riley, pressing his trembling hands against her wound. "Stay with me, please, stay with me." Megan backed away slowly, her wedding dress dragging through the scattered petals on the floor now stained red. Her eyes were locked on Daniel, her husband of less than an hour, standing there like a ghost, the smoke from the gun curling around him like a confession. "What did you do?" she whispered, voice cracking under disbelief. "What did you do?" He didn't answer. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere far away where time hadn't yet caught up to what his hands had done. The sirens began to wail in the distance, faint but growing louder. Guests huddled together, sobbing, whispering prayers. Phones glowed in trembling hands. A child cried out, "Mommy, is she dead?" Megan turned toward Riley's lifeless body, then back to Daniel. Her tears fell silently at first, then came faster, heavier. "You told me you loved me," she said. "How could you bring death into our wedding?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no sound came. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had held Riley once, that had brushed her hair from her eyes, that had written promises he never intended to keep. He had thought he could control the truth. But now it was everywhere, bleeding into the floor, staining everything he ever wanted to hide. Police cars screeched outside. The sound of boots and shouting filled the church entryway. Someone pointed toward him. "That's him. He shot her." Daniel raised his head, blinking through tears. "No," he murmured. "No, it wasn't supposed to." Two officers rushed forward, guns drawn. "Hands where we can see them." He hesitated only a second before obeying, lifting his hands slowly, palms open, eyes unfocused. The weight of his actions settled in, heavy, final, unrelenting. Megan stepped back as the officers cuffed him, her veil slipping from her hair and landing on the floor beside Riley's blood. The two whites, one of innocence, one of death, merged into something haunting. Daniel looked at Megan one last time. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was saying it to, her, Riley, or himself. Megan turned away, unable to look at the man she just vowed to spend her life with. The officers led him out of the church. Cameras flashed outside, voices shouting questions. The world was already spinning the story: the groom, the gun, the woman at the door. As the police car doors shut behind him, Daniel caught a final glimpse of the chapel through the window, the place where his double life had come undone. The sirens faded into the distance. Inside, Megan sank to her knees beside Riley's body, sobbing into her dress, whispering, "Why her? Why today?" No one answered. Only the sound of the rain beginning to fall outside, soft, steady, relentless, filled the silence where love and lies had both died. The rain hadn't stopped since the wedding. It fell hard through the night, washing blood from the church steps and carrying whispers into every corner of town. By morning, the story had already broken. News anchors stood outside the police station, their voices low and grave. Local businessman Daniel Carter was arrested for the fatal shooting of a transgender woman identified as Riley Morgan, who appeared unexpectedly at his wedding yesterday afternoon. Megan watched it all from her living room, still wearing her torn wedding dress. She hadn't slept. The veil was gone, her hair undone, her face pale. Every word from the TV felt like another stab, another reminder that her perfect day had been nothing but a performance. "They're saying she was his ex," one reporter continued. But sources close to the family deny any such relationship. Megan's phone buzzed nonstop. Friends, relatives, journalists, people she hadn't spoken to in years. All asking the same question. "Did you know?" She didn't answer any of them. Across town, Daniel sat in an interrogation room, eyes bloodshot and empty. The air smelled like coffee and metal. The detective, a tired man with gray at his temples, sat across from him, flipping through a folder thick with photographs. "You know, Daniel," the detective said, "I've seen men do terrible things. But it's rare that they do it in front of their wife, their family, and a priest." Daniel didn't respond. He just stared at his cuffed hands. "She was trans, wasn't she?" the detective asked quietly. Daniel's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. The detective slid a photo across the table, a smiling picture of Riley, her eyes bright, taken months before the shooting. "She loved you. You know that?" Daniel looked away. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," the detective said, leaning forward. "Because right now, all we have is a church full of witnesses who saw you pull the trigger." Daniel's voice came out low and shaking. "She shouldn't have come." "But because she didn't fit the life you were pretending to have?" Daniel's hands tightened. "You don't get it," he whispered. "I was done with that part of my life. I had to be." The detective leaned back. "So you decided she couldn't exist anymore?" Daniel slammed his hands on the table. "I didn't mean to shoot her." The detective didn't flinch. "But you did." Outside, reporters swarmed the police station. Protesters gathered by afternoon, half shouting for justice for Riley, half denying the story altogether. "He's not that kind of man," one woman said to a camera. "He loved his wife. That girl must have been lying." The internet turned the tragedy into a battlefield. Some called it murder, others called it shame. A few tried to erase Riley altogether, saying she was just a stranger who made a scene. But her friends began to speak. Old photos surfaced, Daniel and Riley together, smiling at a beach, hands intertwined. Screenshots of messages, emails. The truth, piece by piece, began to bleed through the lies. Megan saw them all. Every image, every text. She felt her stomach twist, realizing how easily he'd lied to both of them. That night, she sat in silence, staring at their wedding rings lying on the table, one gleaming gold, one still in its box. For the first time, she whispered the truth out loud. He loved her. In the interrogation room, Daniel lifted his head at the same moment, as if hearing her from miles away, and whispered to himself, "I loved her." The detective closed the file. "Then why did you pull the trigger?" Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Because loving her meant losing everything. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady and unending, as if the sky itself refused to let the truth stay buried. Before she became the woman at the door, Riley Morgan was just trying to live quietly. She had moved to the city 2 years earlier, a suitcase in one hand, hormone pills in the other, and a name she'd chosen for herself. Riley, it meant courage. She'd read that once and decided it was the word she needed most. That's where she met Daniel. He wasn't like the others. He didn't treat her like a secret. Not at first. He laughed with her, cooked for her, held her hand in public once when he thought no one was looking. He told her she made him feel real. She believed him. But Daniel was good at compartmentalizing, at living half-truths. He called her late at night from the same number he now used to text his wife. He made her believe there was a future waiting somewhere after the fear. "I just need time," he used to whisper. "Once everything settles, you'll see. I'll make it right." Riley waited. When he disappeared for weeks, she convinced herself he was busy. When he came back distant, she convinced herself he was scared. Until the night she saw it, the photo of his engagement, posted online. Daniel in a tuxedo, smiling, his arms around another woman. Megan. Riley stared at that picture for an hour. Then she threw her phone across the room. It shattered like something inside her had. Still, she didn't want revenge. She wanted answers. She sent him messages. Pleading at first, then angry, then broken. "You promised me. Why are you hiding? Do I mean nothing now?" He never replied. 2 weeks before the wedding, she showed up at his office. He froze when he saw her, panic in his eyes. "Riley, you can't be here," he said. "Please. People know me here." She remembered the way he said it. "People know me here. Not I'm sorry. Not I'll explain. Just shame." She left that day and didn't contact him again. Until the morning of the wedding. She woke up before sunrise, restless. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through social media again. The posts, the congratulations, the countdown. It was all there. That's when she decided she couldn't let it happen without saying what needed to be said. Not to ruin him, but to remind him that she existed, that he had loved her once. She put on her favorite white blouse, brushed her hair, and packed the small photograph they'd taken together by the lake, his arm around her, sunlight in her eyes. The picture that once meant everything. On the drive to the church, she rehearsed her words out loud, again and again. "Daniel, I'm not here to hurt you. I just want the truth." Her heart raced the whole time. She almost turned back twice. But something stronger kept her going. A sense of unfinished love, or maybe unfinished pain. When she arrived, the parking lot was full. She stood outside for a long time, watching the guests file in. The sound of laughter, music, the scent of flowers, it all felt wrong, like she was watching someone else's dream. Then she saw him, standing at the altar, smiling, pretending. And that was when she walked in. Every step down that aisle felt like walking into fire. She didn't expect forgiveness or redemption. Just acknowledgement that she had been real, that their story had happened. But what she saw in his eyes wasn't guilt or love. It was terror. Still, she held out the photograph, trembling, her voice cracking as she said, "Tell her the truth." Those would be her last words to him. Riley's story ended in that church, but her truth did not. By the time the sun rose the next day, her name was everywhere. A headline, a symbol, a controversy. Half the world hated her. The other half mourned her. But the one person she'd wanted to see her, truly see her, never would again. Because in Daniel's eyes, she was still something to be erased. The courthouse was packed. Reporters filled every seat, cameras flashing like lightning. The air buzzed with whispers, the kind that feed on scandal more than sorrow. Daniel Carter, once a polished, respected man, now sat behind a scratched wooden table in an ill-fitting suit, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. The trial had begun. The charge was second-degree murder. The defense, a moment of panic. Megan sat in the second row, hands clasped in her lap, her eyes hollow. She hadn't spoken to Daniel since that day. Not a single word. But she came, maybe out of duty, maybe to see if the man on trial still looked like the one she once loved. The prosecutor, a sharp woman with dark eyes, stood and began. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about confusion. It is about control. It's about a man who couldn't live with the truth, so he silenced it. Her voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. Behind her, a photo of Riley appeared on the screen, smiling, alive. The room fell silent. Daniel couldn't look at it. He kept his eyes on the table, jaw tight. When the defense attorney rose, his tone was smoother, calculated. "My client is not a monster," he began. He was a man overwhelmed, humiliated, cornered in front of hundreds. What happened that day was a tragedy, but not murder. A low murmur ran through the crowd. The prosecutor leaned forward. "So humiliation justifies pulling a trigger?" The defense said nothing. Over the following days, witness after witness took the stand. The pastor, trembling. A bridesmaid, crying. A guest who said she'd seen the fear in Riley's eyes. And then came Megan. The courtroom went still as she walked up to the stand, her wedding ring left behind. The prosecutor nodded gently. "Mrs. Carter, can you tell us what you remember?" Megan's voice quivered. "I remember her face," she said softly. "And Daniel's." He looked terrified. Like she was a ghost from a life he wanted to forget. "Did you know Riley before that day?" "No." "Did your husband ever mention her?" Megan hesitated. "No," she whispered. "He didn't." The defense attorney rose for cross-examination. "Mrs. Carter, would you say your husband loved you?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I thought he did." Could it be that he simply snapped? She paused, searching for the truth in her own memory. "No," she said finally. "He didn't snap. He chose." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Daniel closed his eyes. When the jury was dismissed for the day, the crowd poured out into the hallway, reporters shouting questions, activists holding signs. Justice for Riley. Free Daniel Carter. The world had split into sides, and no one seemed to remember there was once love between the two people at the center of it all. That night in his cell, Daniel sat alone, staring at the wall. His lawyer had told him not to speak, not to feel, not to look remorseful or proud, just human enough to pity. But pity wasn't what he felt. It was emptiness. The kind that came from losing everything and realizing it was his own hands that took it away. He thought of Riley, her laugh, her courage, her name written in his phone under a false contact. He remembered how she made him feel real once. And then he remembered the sound. The gunshot. It echoed in his mind as he lay down on the hard bed, whispering into the dark, "I didn't mean to kill her." But somewhere deep inside, a quieter voice answered, "You didn't have to mean it. You just had to pull the trigger." The next morning, the verdict was near, and the world waited to see which version of Daniel Carter it would choose to believe. The courtroom was quieter than usual that morning. The jury had gone into deliberation, and everyone waited, restless, tired, numb. Daniel sat alone at the defense table, his hands folded tightly, his face pale from nights without sleep. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Daniel wasn't listening. He was staring at the photograph on the evidence board, Riley smiling at the lake, sunlight in her hair. He hadn't realized until now how long it had been since he'd seen her alive. When the judge called for a brief recess, Daniel leaned toward his lawyer. His voice was low, trembling. "I need to say something." "Daniel, don't," the lawyer whispered sharply. "Anything you say now could destroy what little chance we have left." He shook his head slowly. "It's already destroyed." Moments later, when the court reconvened, Daniel stood up unexpectedly. The room shifted, murmurs rippled through the benches. His lawyer tried to stop him, but the words had already begun. "Your Honor," he said, his voice echoing through the room, "I'd like to speak." The judge frowned. "Mr. Carter, your attorney has advised." "I know," Daniel interrupted softly, "but I need to tell the truth." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed carefully." Daniel turned to face the courtroom. For the first time, he didn't look like a man defending himself. He looked like someone stripped bare. "I've been hiding for most of my life," he began. "From people, from the truth, from myself." He took a slow breath. "I met Riley 2 years ago, and I loved her. Not because she was perfect, but because she saw me when I couldn't even see myself." A hush fell over the room. Cameras clicked quietly. "But I was afraid," he continued. "Afraid of what people would think, of what my family would say, of losing the image I'd built. I told myself I could move on, marry someone who would make me look right. And when Riley showed up that day," he swallowed hard. "I panicked. I didn't mean to shoot her, but I meant to silence her. And that's the same thing." The words hit the room like a slow explosion. Megan's breath caught in her throat. Tears slid down her cheeks. Daniel turned toward her, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry, Megan. You didn't deserve any of this. You were just a mirror I hid behind." The prosecutor stood, stunned. "Mr. Carter, are you saying this was intentional?" Daniel met her gaze. "I'm saying I wanted her gone. Maybe not dead, but gone." Gasps rippled through the gallery. His lawyer slumped back, defeated. The judge called for order, banging the gavel, but Daniel's voice only grew steadier. "I spent my whole life pretending to be good, to be the man everyone wanted. But when she walked in that church, she shattered the lie. And instead of facing it, I pulled the trigger. That's who I am. That's what I did." His words cracked at the end, barely above a whisper. "And I have to live with that." The silence that followed was unbearable. Finally, the judge exhaled slowly. "Mr. Carter, this court will take your statement into record. You may sit down." Daniel nodded faintly and returned to his seat. The weight of what he'd said pressed against him like gravity. For the first time in months, he stopped shaking. When the jury returned hours later, their verdict seemed inevitable, but Daniel barely heard it. The words guilty echoed distantly, as though from another life. As the bailiff led him away, Daniel turned once more to the crowd. Megan was still sitting there, clutching the small photograph of Riley that had been used in evidence. Their eyes met. There was no hatred left, only the heavy silence of truth finally spoken. Outside, the sky broke open again, rain tapping against the courthouse steps. It sounded almost like applause, or absolution. Daniel whispered under his breath as he was led through the doors, "She deserved better." And somewhere, deep in the quiet spaces between thunder and remorse, it almost felt like Riley answered. Rain fell endlessly that morning, washing over the courthouse steps where reporters once crowded. Now, the cameras were gone, the noise had faded, and all that remained was the memory of a woman whose name still carried weight in the air, Riley. Inside her small apartment, Megan stood by the window, clutching the envelope that had arrived the previous day. It was addressed in a familiar, uneven handwriting, Daniel's. She hadn't decided whether to open it. For weeks after the verdict, she'd replayed that day in her mind, the vows, the gunshot, the silence. It all felt like a nightmare replayed on loop, except the faces had become clearer, and the lies had stopped blurring. Daniel was sentenced to 25 years. No parole for the first 18. The media had branded it the wedding murder, but Megan hated that title. It made it sound theatrical, like a show. Riley wasn't a headline. She was a person. Megan finally tore the envelope open. The letter inside was short, only a page long. "Megan, I don't expect forgiveness. I just need to know someone remembers the truth, not the trial, not the cameras." Riley was brave. She came to that church not to destroy me, but to free me from the lie I forced her into. I ruined everything because I couldn't face what I felt. Don't let the world turn her into a symbol of shame. Let her name mean something more. Daniel. Megan folded the paper slowly. She didn't cry. Not anymore. The tears had run dry weeks ago. What remained was something heavier, acceptance. She looked over at the dresser, where a framed photo of Riley stood. It had been taken during a music festival 2 summers ago, Riley laughing, her hair glowing under string lights. Megan didn't know her back then, but somehow she felt connected, as if their lives had collided for a reason neither asked for but both understood. In the months that followed, Megan began speaking, first quietly at local women's groups, then at community events, and finally at national panels. She didn't speak about the murder directly. She spoke about identity, fear, and silence. About the invisible pain people carry when they have to hide who they are. Each time she said Riley's name on stage, the crowd went still, not from pity, but reverence. The echo of that name began to mean something new, truth. Meanwhile, Daniel spent his days in the prison library. According to the warden's report that made its way into the news, he'd joined a writing program. His essays talked about guilt, identity, and what it means to love someone you were taught to hate. None were signed with his full name, only initials, DC. A journalist once wrote, "The tragedy of Daniel Carter is not that he killed Riley, but that he killed the part of himself that once loved her." Years passed. The church where it all happened closed down. The pews gathered dust, the altar cracked, and vines began to grow through the broken windows. Some nights, locals swore they could hear a woman's voice carried by the wind, humming softly, a voice no one had the heart to name aloud. On the 5th anniversary of the incident, Megan stood by the lake where Riley's ashes had been scattered. She knelt, touching the surface of the water as rain began to fall again. "People still remember you," she whispered. "Not the way the news told it. The real you." For a moment, the ripples shimmered, like a pulse beneath the surface. The wind moved through the trees, carrying faintly, almost musically, the sound of her name. "Riley." Megan smiled softly. "You're free now." She rose, the storm fading into a calm drizzle. In the distance, a single bell tolled, the same one that once signaled a wedding that never truly began. Now it sounded like closure. As she walked away, the camera of life seemed to pull back, from the lake, the town, the church, the courthouse, until everything was small, distant, and quiet. Only the echo of her name remained, weaving itself through rain, wind, and memory, a haunting melody that no one would ever fully forget.